3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Flip Live event. My name is Ruby Stricker, and I am a museum educator at the Intrepid Museum in New York City. I have with me my colleague, Jonathan Millard. He'll be behind the camera there, showing us some of the spaces we have in our museum as we explore some of the places and some of the spacecraft we have at the ship. I want to welcome some of our visitors, some of our viewers today. Mr. Ingles's classroom from Mexico, 7th graders. We have the viewers from Texas, from San Francisco, Miss Jackson's 6th grade class. We have Miss Wilson's class from Houston, Texas. We have a class from Chicago. We have Miss Cope's class from Alberta, Canada. We have classes from all over the country and the world. I want to welcome everyone, and I'm thrilled to have all of you joining us today on our live spacecraft virtual exploration. Today, I'm going to present about some of the spacecraft we have at the Intrepid Museum. We have a number of spacecraft as the Intrepid was involved in a number of different space exploration missions and was rewarded with a space shuttle from NASA. So we're going to be looking at some spacecraft today and talking about Intrepid's involvement in NASA's exploration. Now, before I dive in, if you have access to the chat, throw in there anything you know about space travel already. Also, throughout the program, feel free to put in any questions you have. There will be a live Q&A at the end of the event, and I will be answering as many questions as I can. So whatever platform you're viewing this on, please feel free to ask questions in your chat or your comment, and we'll be able to answer some of those questions at the end of the program. All right, so I'm going to head over to a platform that we use here at the museum called Google Arts and Culture. Now, Google Arts and Culture gives us an inside look of the Intrepid Museum. If you were here with us today, you could climb up these stairs here, walk along our gangway, and enter our ship. The Intrepid ship was built, they started building it in 1941. It was completed in 1943 and was used during World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. So during the Cold War, it was this period of lots of tension and drama between the United States and one other major nation that we now primarily know as Russia, but back then we called the Soviet Union. So it was Russia and a bunch of other small countries come together called the Soviet Union. So the Cold War involved a lot of different aspects, but one of the main parts of the Cold War was a race that we call the space race. And this space race was a race to get to the moon. What we're looking at here is a model of one of the first capsules used in that mission to get to the moon. The model you're looking at here is called the Mercury capsule. The Mercury capsule, named after the planet Mercury, was one of the first capsules used. These capsules held one person. They would hold one astronaut on their mission to the moon. It could be used on top of a number of different rockets blasting off from Earth. Some of these capsules went up into space for only 15 minutes or so and came back down to Earth. And some of them went up into space and orbited the Earth several times before coming back down to land in the ocean. Now, the thing about landing in the ocean is that these capsules would come back down to Earth with one astronaut or later multiple astronauts, land in the water, and they needed someone to come and get them. The thing about the Intrepid is it was a major aircraft carrier out in the middle of the ocean with supplies and medical equipment and food and beds and everything an astronaut could want if they were coming back down from space. So Intrepid's job during these missions was to rescue that astronaut and potentially their capsule um, when that astronaut had come back down to Earth. So this capsule here, the Mercury capsule, the major mission that the Intrepid assisted with was the mission involving this man right here, Scott Carpenter. Scott Carpenter was the fourth man to go to space in a Mercury capsule. He spent about 5 hours in space. He orbited the Earth several times. He was in a capsule that looked just like the one we just saw, about that size. He came back down to Earth and landed in the water, but there were a couple of issues along the way. Scott Carpenter, while he was in space, there were some errors, some issues with the system in his capsule. Now, there are some controversies over whether Scott caused these issues, whether his capsule caused these issues, whether NASA caused these issues. But in the end, his system that triggered his descent back to Earth was triggered a little bit too late. And Scott ended up about 250 miles off course when he landed in the water. Now, Scott landed in the water using one of these things in this photo right here. You may know what these are. This is a parachute. These capsules would have a parachute attached to help slow their descent back down to Earth. Scott was then in one of these capsules in the middle of the ocean and had to wait several hours for a helicopter to come pick him up and bring him back to Intrepid. Now, after the Mercury missions, NASA moved on to bigger and better things. Their goal, of course, was to get to the moon, but they needed to do this in steps. Now, of course, the Mercury capsule was that first step. These capsules we're looking at right now, this capsule we're looking at here, was the second step, the Gemini capsule. The Gemini capsule, much like the constellation Gemini, could hold two people. Now, if you are a fan of astrology, if you like zodiac signs, you might know that Geminis are known for being two-faced. And that's because the Gemini constellation has two people in it in the sky. Now, these Gemini capsules held two people, just like that constellation. So the Gemini missions went to space for a bit longer. These missions could last up to 2 weeks. Um, they were used for testing different bodily functions, eating in space, sleeping in space, um, doing other things that we might need to do on these longer missions that would eventually take us to the moon. Now, Intrepid was involved in a major Gemini mission as well. That mission, of course, involved two men, John Young and Gus Grissom. John and Gus went to space in their Gemini capsule. Now, John and Gus were also in space for about 5 hours, but one of the main goals of their mission was to try out some of the new space food that NASA had been testing. Now, space food, we might know a little bit about space food. It needs to be light, it needs to be easily transportable, it needs to last a long time while astronauts are in space. Back in the 1960s, in 1965, when Gus and John went to space, space food was not that yummy. John and Gus did not like the sound of the gelatinous meat, the icky space food that they were going to have to eat. So, what John and Gus did was they smuggled a sandwich up into space. They stuck a corned beef sandwich in their spacesuit and brought it up to space with them. Now, this got them in a little bit of trouble with NASA for maybe not the reason you might think. Now, NASA was upset that they had just brought something that they weren't supposed to bring. The other reason is that a corned beef sandwich is made with kind of classic sliced bread. The thing about that bread is that it has crumbs that fall on the ground when you eat it. But in space, with very little gravity, Those crumbs can fly around and get in your eyes and in your instruments and in your lungs. And John and Gus are the reason that NASA, the space agencies, don't bring bread like that into space. They only bring things that don't produce crumbs like tortillas and other foods that can't crumble in that same way. Now, I'm going to head over to my colleague Jonathan now and talk about a little bit about what happened after these space capsules. After these missions to the moon, you can see Jonathan's hand there waving hello. After these missions to the moon, NASA decided on a new goal. A new goal. NASA chose NASA chose these larger space exploratory objects called space shuttles. What we're looking at here is the first space shuttle orbiter Enterprise. Enterprise was the prototype space shuttle. It was used to test things out like weight and wing shape and the heat shield capacity for all of the different space shuttles that would come after it. Now, like I mentioned before, Intrepid was involved in the space race. It rescued these space capsules. And eventually, NASA said, the Intrepid, we are so grateful for all of your work in the space race. We think you should have a space shuttle to put on display. Now, these space shuttles, the space shuttle program started shortly after the end of the missions, NASA's missions to the moon. And they were important for a number of reasons. First, they could bring a whole lot more people into space. Now, Jonathan's showing us sort of the front of the Enterprise here. Now, the Enterprise is a whole lot bigger than those capsules that we were looking at before, and it could fit 7 to 10, sometimes up to 12 people up in this front part of the shuttle. It could bring 7 to 10, 12 people up into space to live and work for extended periods of time. So the Enterprise and shuttles after it, shuttles after the Enterprise, could bring these astronauts up to live and work on what was eventually called the International Space Station. It could bring astronauts to space to launch and repair telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope, and it could bring astronauts up to launch and repair satellites as well. Now, Enterprise had to be large because it had to bring up the types of technology needed to repair these telescopes, satellites, and the types of things that astronauts needed to feed themselves, to live, to work, to have healthy lives in space for up to 6 months at a time. So think things like beds and food and exercise equipment needed to fit in these shuttles as well. Now, these space shuttles functioned from about the 1980s until 2012. Um, they could move this really large technology into space. They didn't go all the way to the moon, but they stayed in what we call low Earth orbit. So, orbiting around the Earth, like those early capsules, like the Mercury and Gemini capsules that we were looking at before. Now, I'm going to head back to my presentation. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to head back to my presentation and take a look at some of these photos. This first photo is a photo of one of our space shuttles launching off of Earth and into space. So when a space shuttle launched into space, it would be attached to 2 rocket boosters and 1 external fuel tank here. So as we saw before, our space capsule sat on top of a rocket, whereas these space shuttles were attached to rockets and their fuel as they launched. Now, I want us to notice the shape and the size of these space shuttles. These space shuttles were made to look more like airplanes than the capsules were before them. And that's because we wanted these space shuttles to be reusable, first of all, and to be able to land on Earth much like an airplane. Now, this left image is an image of Enterprise when it was being tested, when it was being used as a prototype, it would fly on the back of a major airplane like a 747 to test out the way it could fly inside Earth's atmosphere. On the right-hand side, we can see a shuttle landing on a runway just like an airplane. So these shuttles would come back down to Earth and land on a runway just like an airplane, and thus they didn't need to be rescued by a ship. They didn't need to be brought aboard in the middle of the ocean. They could land, and these shuttles would be ready for reuse in later missions. So the space shuttle program, the shuttles used in the space shuttle program could be reused over and over again to bring astronauts to and from space, to and from the International Space Station, to and from the Hubble Space Telescope, and to and from the satellites that they were launching and repairing. All right. I want to move on now to the activity we have available for you on our Flip group at flip.com/intrepid. Now, on flip.com/intrepid, you can find visual instructions for building your own space capsule with all sorts of household materials. These space capsules can look however you want. We have an assorted number of examples on there for you to see, but we encourage you to design them to be as creative as possible. All they need to do is protect your astronauts from the climate in space and from the exit and re-entry in the atmosphere. We encourage you to post your results, post photos of the space capsules that you produce, along with any questions you have that don't get answered today. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a quick selfie together. So we're going to take a quick selfie together. We're going to give you about a minute or so to gather together, and we will take a selfie together. So I think we will roll the tape, we'll gather together, and then we will take a selfie as a group. Selfie. All right. We are going to take a few questions now, have a Q&A, so continue to add your questions in the comments or uh, the whatever section you have on your streaming. Now, I have one question that's come through. Mr. Watkins' class is asking who gets to decide on the name for the shuttle. That's a great question. Now, normally NASA makes that decision. The Enterprise, uh, the shuttle that we have at the museum that is called the Enterprise, and it was the first space shuttle orbiter. Um, Normally, that those shuttles would be named after something in space. The shuttle was going to be named after a constellation, but fans of the show Star Trek, it was a TV show. It still is a show and a series of movies. It was a really, really big TV show in the 1970s and 1980s. Fans of the show Star Trek requested and sent many, many letters to NASA to request that it be named Enterprise. So in the show Star Trek, the main star ship was named Enterprise or is named Enterprise in the current iterations as well. So many fans of the show uh, requested that it be named Enterprise, and they obliged and named it Enterprise. So our next question is, why didn't NASA use space shuttles to go to the moon? So the biggest issue with this was that space shuttles would require way more fuel than they had the capacity to get to the moon. What much more fuel than the capsules required to get to the moon, and that's because of their size primarily. The space shuttles were used to bring large amounts of stuff into space, whether that be the astronauts' personal items or the scientific equipment or whatever they needed to repair or launch satellites. Um, and so they needed a grand amount of fuel to get that into space, and they didn't have that capability. They couldn't attach the amount of fuel it would require to get it to the moon. The moon is much further away than the low Earth orbit that space shuttle was getting to. Now, Mr. Sperry's class has asked, how do you bathe on a shuttle? That's a great question. So, uh, one way is that a lot of astronauts use moist wipes and dry shampoo, right? If you don't wash your hair for a while, you might use dry shampoo, or like more wipes that we might use for a quick bath when we're camping on shuttles. Um, some astronauts on shuttles would end up heading to the International Space Station, and at the International Space Station, they have more capabilities for bathing, but dry shampoo and moist wipes. So, where did the Enterprise get its name? It got its name from, again, the fans of Star Trek, who wrote in to request that this first space shuttle be named after the starship Enterprise. So, we have the question, what do space capsules look like today? So that's a great question. As I mentioned, NASA has moved away from our space shuttle. The space shuttle program ended in 2013, um, and NASA has moved back to using space capsules. Now, these space capsules that NASA is using today look like the space capsules that they were using in the 1960s. They are sort of conical shaped. The main space capsule that they're using today is called the Orion capsule, and that is the capsule that will likely be used, that they're planning on using to go back to the moon in the next several years, to go back to space and go back to the moon. Um, Jonathan is actually still in the space shuttle pavilion there and can show us the Soyuz capsule. This is the capsule that was used by the Soviet Union and now Russia. Um, this is the capsule that the Russia has used in different iterations, so it's changed over time. But the capsule that Russia has used for a long time and is still using, um, and the capsules that NASA is using today have taken on some of the aspects of the Soyuz capsule and some of the aspects of the capsules that we used to use. So the Soyuz capsule that Jonathan is showing now um, is again a Russian capsule, and these are the capsules that the Soviet Union was using and now Russia. And he's showing us the inside and the outside. All right. Thank you, Jonathan. So we have one more question. It looks like, how do you control the ship if there is no gravity? That's a great question. So, first off, I want to correct one point that there is a little bit of gravity in space. Anywhere that we are, anywhere that there is a planet somewhere or any type of body, right? Any type of thing, there's going to be some amount of gravity, but there's only a little bit out there in space. Um, and that's a great question about how do you control the ship in space. Now, when we have our astronauts, our shuttle pilots, our orbiter pilots in space, um, first of all, the main thing that these shuttles are doing is they're getting into orbit. so that they're able to go around the Earth. And they go around the Earth at a constant speed at about 17,500 miles per hour and are constantly moving at that speed and going around the Earth. If they need to move themselves, which is what they do, for example, when they are going back down to Earth, um, they use a system of basically spontaneous combustion. So they combine two chemicals in. John's showing us the nose of the shuttle here, which is where this happens in these, like in those holes that you're seeing. They combine two chemicals that creates an explosion, and they're able to control that explosion to maneuver the shuttle in different ways, to maneuver the shuttle in the different directions that they want it to move. So that explosion creates what we call the thrust that the shuttle needs to move in different ways. So because we don't have the gravity and the air around it to move in the typical way we think about an airplane, we use these spontaneous combustion, these explosions inside the shuttle to move the nose of the orbiter in different ways. All right. If you have any other questions, please head to flip.com/intrepid to our group page. All right. And put those questions in our Ask an Expert on our Ask an Expert page. Next week at our second event, we will answer a few questions live at the start of the event. You can also find, again, the visual instructions for this week's activity on our Flip group, where you can post your activity, you can post your space capsule, and you can ask any questions that you have. Next week on October 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, we will learn about object collections and storage on Intrepid. We will hear from our colleague Danielle Swanson, where she will discuss her role as collections manager at Intrepid. She'll talk about being a collections manager, what collection storage is like on a ship like this, and in a museum in general. And she'll talk about one of our favorite collections and sort of its historical and its significance to our museum. The week after that, on October 11th, at again 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be talking about aircraft restoration. We'll have another colleague, Peter Taraka, discuss aircraft on board, discuss what they do in our aircraft restoration hangar, um, taking care of and making sure all of the aircraft we have on board look good and look how they looked when Intrepid was in service or when these airplanes were being used. And then he'll talk about the current project that they're working on in the hangar. For each of these events, we'll have another activity and visual instructions available for you on our Flip group. I want to thank everyone for joining us again today. Um, Please head over to our Flip page again, flip.com/intrepid, to put any questions and to complete your space capsule and show us your completed project. I can't wait to see you all next week and on the 11th. Thank you all for joining.